One of the weirder events of the Second World War was the breakdown in the relationship between the Anglo-American command in the Pacific and the Chinese government of Chiang Kai-shek. The collapse in the relationship would culminate in the removal of Joseph Stilwell, America's commander in the region, and with the relationship never really recovering, it would also explain American hostility and hesitance to intercede with the Chinese Civil War. This, of course, leading to the creation of the Chinese Communist state that we have today, who are America's primary adversary. So the question needs answering is why? And answering this question is a mess. Sources on both sides recount many, often contradictory tales of what happened, but the entire situation can be easily broken down into two major reasons: Stilwell's personal animosity towards Chiang Kai-shek's rule in China, and the West's strategy of prioritizing Europe. This reason is just plainly obvious. The war in China had started 2 years prior to that in Europe, with the 1937 Marco Polo Bridge incident, but Western assistance to the Chinese war effort was almost non-existent. The Soviet Union would be the largest supplier, but as the bulk of this equipment would be going towards communist forces, the nationalists under Chiang would see very little of it. The first aid would come in the form of steel embargoes by the US in 1941, but for many in China it was too little too late. This would brew resentment among many in China's leadership, as losses from 37 to 41 were astronomical, and with a whole number of notable war crimes also being committed, there was a feeling that the Chinese people had been abandoned to the Japanese war machine. When you go and research World War II generals, you quickly come to the conclusion that all of the generals you have heard of were assholes, and Stilwell was no exception. He had this nasty habit of showing up somewhere new, insulting the Allied generals who put forward their own ideas, and then coming to the conclusion that he was in fact the smartest man in the room, and his opinion was the only one that mattered. This is the reason he was in Asia to begin with, as his hostility towards British command in North Africa, and his constant request to invade Spain, meant he was practically retired until American leadership started to prioritize China in 1942. So they sent him to be the Generalissimo's chief of staff. This is a tangent, but Cheng's nickname is Peanut, so Generalissimo Peanut is how he is routinely identified in official paperwork. It is beyond dumb to read. Back to the war, and a major point of contention for Stilwell is that Peanut was fucking clueless, in his own opinion. As I said earlier, sourcing around this is a mess of egos, but a somewhat unbiased account of their hostility towards one another comes from Sir William Slim, the British commander in Burma, who was holding open the supply route to China. He states, "The only thing that was surprising was that the open breach did not come sooner. The Americans had no confidence in the Chinaman's military judgment or political intrigue. There was also a significant quantity of corruption within nationalist commands, which led to an increase in this animosity between the two. This would lead Stilwell to micromanage the use of American lend-lease in the campaigns and battles that Stilwell preferred. A good example of this is the Chinese units that served under British command in Burma. They were well equipped with high morale, this being done because Stilwell wanted to capture more air bases in eastern India and northern Burma, so he could get more shipments into the Chinese interior. But Cheng would see some of these deployments as a waste, as the Japanese were still advancing into central China. The last and biggest problem appeared with Stilwell wanted to create an American-trained, equipped and led army in China, whereas the Chinese wanted to keep their German doctrines that they'd had from before the war. In fact, Stilwell used the 14th Army in Burma, an army who were mostly Indian and African but commanded and supplied by British, as what a new model army would look like. But Stilwell had too many enemies, and all of the animosity that was created ultimately ended in his removal. What's strange is the number of people who, after his reassignment to the commander of ground forces, would change their mind on him. I can find accounts of the American 14th Air Force, who were the ones flying most of the supplies into China, celebrating his removal, along with British and American commanders in the Pacific, happy they could now set up a more unified command structure without everything getting so heated. But all of this hatred seems to always get shifted to the opinion of somebody else. So, Stilwell's personal animosity to the task at hand and all the constant arguments of his own creation would lead to his constant transfer away from areas that he thought he was needed in, and areas that needed tact and diplomacy. This is not to take away from his skill. He was, by some accounts, a skilled officer, but he had little time for the politics what came with his role, and over the course of the war in the East he would develop a mistrust of modern tactics. being highly skeptical in jungle special forces operations and massed air power. His transfer away from China would also diminish the theatre's importance, as over 1943, 44, and 45, America's island hopping campaign, Britain's war in Burma, and the combined submarine and naval warfare would become more a focus. But his departure and the turmoil that followed had set back Sino-Western relations,